Here we are, day 4, week 3, or day 14 of the 30-day program. This week, we've been focusing ultimately on the objective of defining the targets that help us to meet and ideally exceed expectations, and ultimately delivering outcomes that are exemplary. Like going back to the objective of the program and the transformation that we're seeking here. Yesterday, we focused going out into the field and interviewing our stakeholders and moving those questions in, anticipating the responses from the stakeholders and getting the actual information, being that investigator, seeking that qualitative data that doesn't show up in spreadsheets and reports and visualizations that is going to help us to set those targets that are going to make a huge difference for our business, our team, our stakeholders, and ourselves. Today, we're going to focus on taking the information that you acquired and actually synthesizing it into a set of opportunities to choose from, to focus on, and we'll make the choices tomorrow and the final day of the week for defining the targets, and we'll go into that criteria tomorrow. But let's talk about today. Let's talk about synthesizing the research that you've done as that transformational leader going out there and seeking information. So what are we going to do today? We need to make sense of the information that you've gathered from at least hopefully 3 stakeholders, depending upon the size of your organization. Ideally more than that. And what we're going to do and what we're going to accomplish is we're going to start piecing together this information in a systematic way and start to synthesize some themes on it. And the themes become the options that we could then use to ultimately define the targets. And there's going to be 2 types of synthesis. We're going to focus, you'll note, we'll use a grid, and across the grid, it'll be synthesizing information from the individual and or their team, and then columns synthesizing the information from the group of people that you spoke with and the different areas. And the questions align to areas, and you'll see this in a moment. So what ultimately is synthesis? So we want to define, we want to understand, we want to find and define the patterns that we're seeing in the data. And those patterns are going to become the options for our targets. It's what we're ultimately looking for. And the table that you're going to see in a moment is going to help us do that. Again, when you see this table, the rows are going to be people and teams. The columns are going to be across people and teams in order to find some themes in our research. And this is what the table looks like. So the columns are aligned to the questions that I've provided to you. And those questions, again, are based upon types of information that we are seeking that is going to enable us to define and effectively and efficiently execute against those targets from the patterns that we're finding from the information. So what you want to do here is for each person you interviewed, the interviewee, going across the row against the questions that you asked and the notes that you took, what were some of the themes that you heard from the person in these different areas? And how can you document them at a high level in each one of these areas? And then in the column all the way on the right, you want to summarize the responses. So is there like an overall theme for this person? Are there some very interesting pieces of information that are very definitive about this person? And I'll give an example coming up on the next slides. And then you want to go to the columns. So after repeating this exercise in the rows for each person that you interviewed and documenting the patterns and the themes and the summaries, you're going to do the same for each of the types of information across the interviewees. And at category level, so in the columns, this will help us to start to identify like themes across teams and stakeholders. And some of these things may be great opportunities to take on to have a massive impact, help you understand big picture things. Now, depending upon the type of data that you've collected and the work that you put here, I strongly suggest putting a good amount of effort into this, because this is ultimately informing the types of work you want to focus on and what you're going to adjust in order to focus on that work. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. So make the investment here, like the investment in the data and the investment in putting together your targets are key, right? All the other aspects around leadership, like how you communicate and your ability to execute and your ability to inspire and your ability to motivate, will mean nothing if you're ultimately driving people towards the wrong targets. So if you show up in the boardroom one day and the board's like, wow, you really inspired people, you've really you've got high ratings in your performance management in these areas, and you're like energizing people, but you're actually not delivering against the targets for our shareholders, you're going to have a difficult time to justify your existence. Now, I understand that's at the most top level in an organization, but similar conversations can happen at any level. And the reason that I just took a moment to pause here to emphasize that is because of the importance of this information. So invest the time in this information and synthesizing it to make everything else that you're working hard to do and to transform yourself to be worth it. So let's move on to an example. So here's an example of me interviewing somebody. And so it's interviewee one, and going across the row and synthesizing some of the information. So again, the core, what is like core to the person and to the company as well. And sometimes these things intersect and sometimes they don't. So in this example, for this hypothetical person, it's to realize the vision of their lifelong work. They're a senior person, they've had a theme throughout their career, and they want that to happen. And then as part of the overall strategy, immediate goal of the company is to acquire another company, to get one company. And there's also a flagship product that there's a vision for getting adopted into the marketplace. And then ultimately, from a core standpoint, it's to increase the enterprise value of the company. So what the market sees the company being worth. And what are some of the gaps that are being faced by this person that will align to some of the things that the person spoke about in the core. So you have to prove things to others. So there has to be a proof of concept. It's got to be piloted. It's got to happen. It's got to succeed. The acquisition that happens needs to happen in an environment that doesn't favor the buyer, it favors the seller. So that means things could have to be bought at a higher price than might be desired. And there's a series of challenges that could come up with that. Moving on to the challenges from this person's perspective, like small team. How do we do these things with a small team? The engagement cycle, the pre-sale cycle on getting the product adopted could be quite long, or it's perceived to be long because of the type of product that it is. And in the current environment, because of the high demand and the position of sellers in the market and seasonality, the pipeline for acquisitions is sparse. These are all challenges that this person is confronted with and impacts their accountability. So my role in this circumstance, how does it have a positive impact? Well, build the systems for scaling the company. It's kind of an expectation there. and then helping clients with expertise on the flagship product side, again, an expectation of the role's negative impact. So like what is the cadence and the frequency and the process of doing these things? And if that's wrong, it could take too long. And also on the product side, someone in my role perhaps doesn't have the specific product expertise to jump in and give the depth to the processes and make the go-to-market to happen quite quickly or as desired, or as is needed. And then also because of that lack of information, the potential negative impact of the role, because the person is maybe not subject matter expertise, has that subject matter expertise, or the role doesn't have that subject matter expertise, is the prioritization of what's being sequenced. So these are aspects of this role that could possibly make have a negative impact for this person that's being interviewed. So how does my role improve this person's ability to do their work? It brings structure to chaos. It enables things or value to be realized faster. What type of accountability does this person I interview expect from my role? Weekly one-on-ones. This is the best format to discuss what needs to be discussed. And what do they expect of someone in my role to deliver? Kind of implied it from the other questions and verifying it from the later questions. Need to deliver that proof of concept. It's got to happen within a quarter. That's meat. Like for someone in my role, they need to do that. What's the exceeds expectation? So still have to do the meat, can't skip that. But in order to exceed those expectations in the role that I have, the structures have to be put in place as the business is happening. So this is a typical build the plane while you're flying it scenario. So in order to exceed expectations, have to go beyond this deliverable of the proof of concept in the quarter, but also have to blaze the trail and create the structures as we're achieving the proof of concept. So I'm summarizing row. I go through all these points, and how would I summarize this? So need to be highly focused on selling a flagship product while implementing that flagship product or products. And at the same time, need to blaze that trail and set up structures for the business as these proofs of concepts are being executed in the marketplace. Now let's look at an example of going down the column or in the category for that specific type of information, which is the core, and looking across multiple people that have been interviewed. So what are different core statements that I've heard in the interview process? Already talked about the first person, like the realization of the lifelong work, demand for the flagship product, creating the enterprise value for the organization. For the next person, again, grow enterprise value. This is starting to sound like theme. And then more specifically, growing recurring revenue from repeat customers and its proportion of the business that it needs to be in terms of like the core responsibility of the organization. And then the next person is discussing what they expect the profit margin to be in terms of the core of the business. And then the next person is thinking about the investors, the people that are putting money into the firm and their expected return on working with the company, allocating capital to it. So looking down at this category of the core for the people that have been interviewed as part of my qualitative research, what is the expectation and possibly some meet expectations or exceeds expectations? So I synthesize this together, and what I interpret is that you need to create an operating system that grows demand and supply, repeat revenue from customers, and enterprise value of the entire company to ultimately give a return to investors within a certain number of expected years. So this is the theme that I'm hearing across stakeholders, nicely put together into a summary for the category when we are talking about the core. And then I can use this piece of information for helping to define the targets and also picking which ones I should be focused on. And we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. But before we move on, let's talk about some closing points and also just reflecting. Remember, we did this like anticipation exercise where we played out the scenarios in our head. And then we did this understand exercise where we actually spoke with people. And then we synthesized that data into these team and individual themes and category themes in the columns. So you think about this, just take a moment to reflect, celebrate, you put in the work to do this process. Perhaps this is the first time you've ever done anything like this, and just like think about how aware were you on some of this information, either through anticipation or through prior conversations or things that you've had access to previously. Now that you're aware of this information, how do you think it could possibly change things for you? Like, now that you know, what kind of difference could this make in your ability to drive performance for yourself and others in your career? How might knowing this information consistently change things in your life? And then looking back at the assumptions that you made through this process of anticipating expectations, how does that compare to the reality? And thinking about maybe how far or how close you are to that. And then if you look at these stakeholders in some ways as gatekeepers, whether it's the types of outcomes you want to achieve for the business, whether it's the types of opportunities you want to generate for yourself in your career, thinking about knowing this information and how that might change things for you with these people that can have an impact on what you do and who you want to become. And let's talk a little bit about accessibility. Again, we're always going back to motivation and accessibility so that we can achieve the desired behaviors that we want to. You know, there's sometimes some people have a fear of asking for these meetings or asking to create opportunities to seek this information. Like, in reality, how challenging was that? Did you get a lot of pushback on it, or were people very open? What was harder, the actual scheduling of the meeting and the fear of doing it, or the execution of the meeting? As you were doing each one of these interviews, did you notice an improvement? And when you did notice an improvement, hopefully you did you celebrate that and say, you know, I'm learning how to do this? And then going back to those assumptions, what you're anticipating versus what was real, like how far off were you in that? You know, an ideal place that we get to through this habit is we're actually decreasing that delta, like between what you anticipate and what is real, and developing that skill set over time. And in fact, some of the greatest leaders, that's one of the things that differentiates them, is the ability to make the decision on limited amounts of information and it actually being grounded in reality and being correct. And as you do this exercise, as I said, you will be able to hone this skill, make it better, close that gap between what is real and what is anticipated, and leverage this skill in your leadership practice and build yourself up as that transformational leader. All right. Looks like I'm having some difficulties with the slide. Let me adjust the settings. I'll be right back. Okay, there we are. Things are working again. Thanks for your patience. So why do we reflect? It's really to stir that emotion, that motivation, like in celebration. Again, motivation, the more you motivate yourself, the higher likelihood that you complete the behavior. And when we have that practice of motivation and we control that, we're going to consistently hit those outcomes that are behaviors that we want to implement. And just to drive this point home again, this process of anticipating and understanding over time, closing that gap where you develop your skill to do that, will be one of the key things that will strengthen your leadership brand and your practice and your ability to deliver outcomes. One of the interesting things that I found when I was working at Google was one of the key differentiators between the strongest leaders in the organization is this ability to make decisions based upon limited information, because you're understanding the reality of the situation, the expectations, the cores, the challenges, the gaps, the adjustments that need to be made. And you can, just like anything else you practice, you can execute this quickly. So what do you need to do today in terms of the action item? Take the information that you've got, that people afforded you the opportunity of their time to give you that information, and synthesize it. Do what we talked about today. Get to those themes and the categories, get to the themes at the person and the team levels, because we're then going to take that information tomorrow to ultimately define what the targets are. That's it for today. I'm looking forward to tomorrow. If you need more time to gather this information, do it. Again, put the time into this part of the program, into your transformation to make this happen. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.